Today we set a bit of context for our discussion of the freedom foreknowledge problem. Context is important in understanding the freedom foreknowledge problem because it can be characterized and has been characterized historically in a way that just involves a blatant fallacy. So we're going to compare different kinds of fatalisms. Sometimes they're called determinisms, but for the most part, I try to stick with the language of fatalism rather than determinism, because I think determinism has natural connotations that connect it with scientific determinism, cosmic determinism, and the like, and that's not the kind of determinism that's in question here. In any case, let's begin by taking a look at an Augustine quote. This is from the late part of the 5th century AD. Augustine lived 354 to 430. So the quote is from that period of time, and it's one of the earliest, most articulate quotes about what the freedom foreknowledge problem is. So here's the Augustine quote. Your trouble is this. You wonder how it can be that these two propositions are not contradictory and incompatible. Namely, that God has foreknowledge of all future events, and that we sin voluntarily and not by necessity. Okay, just take a break from the quote right there. So he says, the problem is this. You don't see how to reconcile foreknowledge with voluntariness, sinning or behaving in general. Augustine is pretty big on sin. He likes to focus on that, but it has nothing to do with whether your behavior is good or bad or neutral. It doesn't matter. The question is about the voluntariness of our behavior, not its valence, positive, negative, or neutral. Okay, back to the quote. So the problem is this. You don't understand how to reconcile these two. You don't understand how they can be incompatible. Here comes the explanation of the argument. For if you say God foreknows that a man will sin, he must necessarily sin. But if there's necessity, there is no voluntary choice of sinning, but rather fixed and unavoidable necessity. Okay, that's the Augustine quote. It has an argument in it. We'll come back to the argument, but I want to read you another version, this time a little more elliptical, but from later on. So it may be elliptical because people are already familiar with the problem, so you don't have to lay things out. So this is from Maimonides. Maimonides says this. Maimonides, the dates on Maimonides are 1135 to 1204. Maimonides writes, does God know or does he not know that a certain individual will be good or bad? If thou sayest he knows, then it necessarily follows that that man is compelled to act as God knew beforehand he would act. Otherwise, God's knowledge would be imperfect. So in both Augustine and Maimonides, there's this worry about, in Augustine, fixed and unavoidable necessity, which threatens voluntary choice. In Maimonides, the language is about compulsion, whether you're compelled to act the way you're going to act, whether the future is compulsory or optional or open in some sense like that. Those are the worries. Now, the reason we have to be careful with both of these quotes is because both of these quotes contain a well-known modal fallacy. It's the fallacy in the Middle Ages. This fallacy was called the fallacy of confusing the necessity of the consequence with the necessity of the consequent. Now, if you know exactly what that means, good for you. It sounds like word salad, I remember the first time I heard it, I just thought it was gobbledygook. It's one of those things, there's a certain cadence and rhythm and repetitive sound to it that's attractive to the human ear, but it also can interfere with understanding. So the necessity of the consequent. Consequent here is the backside of conditional. So a conditional is represented typically with an arrow. You have a formula before the arrow and you have a formula after the arrow. What's before the arrow is called the antecedent of the conditional. What is after the arrow is the consequent of the conditional. So when you talk about the necessity of the consequent, you're talking about the consequent, the formula after the arrow, being necessarily true. Well, what's this other thing, the necessity of the consequence? Well, the consequence is what the arrow represents. It says there's a consequence relation between the antecedent and the consequent. Now, if you want the consequent to be necessary, you put the necessity operator on the thing after the arrow. If you want the consequence relation itself to be necessary, you enclose the entire conditional, starting before the antecedent and closing the parentheses after the consequent, and you put the necessity operator out front of that. Sometimes these two readings are called the de dicto reading for the necessity of the consequence, and the de re reading for the necessity of the consequent. We don't need to get into the technical details about whether that characterization is accurate or misleading or whatever. It doesn't matter. What we have here is a scope issue. It's simply a scope issue. You have a necessity operator. The question is, what will its scope be? Will it have narrow scope so that it attaches just to the consequent of the conditional? Or will it have wide scope where it sits out front of the entire conditional statement itself? Scope fallacies have a long history in philosophy. In the 20th century, the most famous discussion of scope fallacies is in Bertrand Russell's On Denoting from 1905. Russell talked about scope fallacies because he wanted to avoid the ontology of Alexius Meinong. Meinong held that every denoting phrase, every sentence that has a subject where the subject of the sentence pretends to name something has to, in fact, name a piece of our ontology. You have to be careful how you say this. You can't just say it names something. In a sense, that's true, but it names something in the ontology. So Meinong was well aware that there are phrases that are denoting phrases in English, but the things that they talk about don't exist. So Ponce de Leon was slandered by having it be spread about him that he was looking for the fountain of youth. It turns out he was not doing any such thing, but suppose it were true. You could do it. You could search for the golden mountain. You can search for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Well, here we have the fountain of youth, the golden mountain, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I guess there's only one of those. I don't know. But in any case, each of these denoting phrases, Meinong said, had to have a referent of some sort or other. He knew that there wasn't any pot of gold, fountain of youth, golden mountain, round square. He knew those things don't actually exist. So he had to bifurcate his ontology into two parts. The part of the ontology that included things that exist and the part of the ontology that included things that don't exist, things that we might say subsist. Okay, now Russell thought this showed a really lack of respect for reality. He said Meinong lacked a healthy sense of reality. Strikes me as right. You don't need to do ontology this way, and especially you don't need to be misled by language. And that's what Russell's on denoting attempted to accomplish by offering an account of the logical structure of denoting phrases so that you had no reason to try to find a referent for a denoting phrase anymore. Here's the example of scope fallacies that Russell liked to pay attention to. So if you've got to talk about the Golden Mountain, or the one that he talked about the most, the present King of France, if you deny something about the present King of France, the negation can have wide or narrow scope. So if you say the present King of France is not bald, the narrow scope reading puts the negation as far back on the sentence as you can get. And so it is saying there is a present King of France and he's got a bunch of hair, at least enough not to be counted as bald. Okay, that's putting the negation on the predicate. You can call that property, the property of being not bald, the complement of the property of being bald. So there's being bald and there's being non-bald. The narrow scope reading says the present King of France has the non-bald property. Wide scope reading puts the negation way out front. It says it's false that the present King of France is bald. Now, Russell used this scope fallacy to show how you can say the present King of France is not bald without committing yourself to the reality in some sense or other of the present King of France. You just read the sentence with the negation having wide scope. Okay, so scope fallacies are very important in the history of philosophy, and one of them has to do with the necessity operator. Now look back at what Augustine said. Augustine's argument focused on this claim as a premise. For if you say God foreknows that a man will sin, he must necessarily sin. All right, so the must word there is the necessity operator. And the sentence itself is conditional. If God foreknows that a man will sin, he must sin. All right, so pull out the necessity operator, you end up with this conditional claim. If God foreknows that a man will sin, that man will sin. The question now is, where do you want to put the necessity operator? Well, you can give it wide or narrow scope. If you give it wide scope, it just says it's a necessary truth that if God foreknows that a man will sin, then that man will sin. Now, to the extent that you like the usual assumption that knowledge is factive, that you can't know something that's false, that reading is obviously true. So the usual, typical assumption about the nature of knowledge is that knowing P requires the truth of P. Knowledge implies truth, and that would be a necessary truth. So all you did here for Augustine's quote, if you use the wide scope reading, is you plug in God as the knower, and you plug in the claim about a man sinning as the value for the sentence in question. And now you have just the mundane, ordinary assumption that knowledge requires truth. All right, but that's not going to get you anything problematic. I mean, if I know that you're going to get up at 9 a.m. tomorrow, nobody's tempted to think that that compels you to get up at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Still, the wide scope reading of the claim turns out to be true. It's a necessary truth that if I know you're going to get up at 9 o'clock tomorrow, you're going to get up at 9 o'clock tomorrow. Otherwise, I didn't know it. So what's the narrow scope reading? Well, that's the one that would introduce the notion of compulsion. So on the narrow scope reading, you get this claim. If God knows that you're going to sin, then of necessity, it's a necessary truth that you sin. Now, if it's a necessary truth that you sin, there's no possibility of any sort under which you don't sin. And then the question of how in the world that could be a voluntary choice on your part, becomes important and central. So it looks like Augustine needs the narrow scope reading. The wide scope reading is clearly true, but won't get him the conclusion that he wants. The narrow scope reading will get him the conclusion that he wants, but why would anybody be tempted to think that claim was true once you see that the wide scope reading is natural and intuitive and widely accepted? That's the reading you would go with. And then when he introduces the narrow scope reading and points out the problem that this would create, it looks like the proper response could be, or a proper response could be, I just don't think that claim is true. You're confusing the necessity of the consequent with the necessity of the consequence. Your argument is not compelling at all.